East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Local to tonight's top stories from East Asia. North Korea test fires its first long-range ballistic missile in almost a year, in a fiery warning to the US and its allies that it can and will strike back under what it sees as provocation. When key ally South Korea quarrel on the ground between activists and locals over anti-Pyongyang leaflets intended for delivery across the fortified border. Typhoon Kong-rey weakens but is still Taiwan's largest storm in decades as it makes landfall, shutting financial markets and forcing the cancellation of hundreds of flights. As a tale of two cities, Hong Kong's economy growing at the slowest pace in more than a year, while the AI boom helping Taiwan's expand faster than expected. And also in the Bulletin, see how the US-China trade war is having an impact on so-called green gold ginseng. North Korea has fired what appears to be a new type of solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile towards the East Sea. This comes a day after South Korea warned it was preparing for a test launch. South Korea's military says Pyongyang could be trying to bolster its leverage ahead of the U.S. presidential election next week. In response, Seoul announced new export controls on materials needed to produce solid-fuel missiles. CNA's Lim Yun-suk with this report.
This was the first intercontinental ballistic missile test since December last year. North Korea called the one test on a Thursday morning the world's most powerful strategic weapon, saying that it was a warning to enemies that have been threatening its security. South Korea condemned this launch, which came as Washington warned that North Korean troops in Russian uniforms are heading towards Ukraine.
우리 군은 김정은 정권의 불법적이고 무모한 도발을 규탄하며 지속적인 오물, 쓰레기 풍선 살포와 러시아의 총알바지 용병 파견, 핵실험 준비 등 한반도와 국제사회의 평화와 안정을 해치는 행위를 즉각 중단할 것을 강력히 촉구한다.
South Korea and Japan say they're closely coordinating with the U.S. over the latest North Korean weapons test.
今回発射された弾道ミサイルは、飛翔時間が約86分でありまして、これまでで最長の飛翔時間であったこと、飛翔高度が最高高度7000キロを超えると推定され、これまでで最高の飛翔高度であったこと、などを、総合的に勘案した上で、従来のものとは違うというふうにご発言があったものと承知をしております。
South Korea and the USA, an estimated 11,000 North Korean troops have been deployed to Russia for its war in Ukraine. Pyongyang and Moscow signed a defense pact earlier this year where they agreed to immediately provide military assistance using all means if either is attacked. The North's latest deployment of troops to Russia has raised concerns in Seoul, as both Koreas are still technically at war.
두 가지의 레드라인이 있어요. 첫 번째, 정말 북한군을 투입을 하게 될 경우에 그건 북한군이 우크라이나 전쟁에서 현대전 경험을 쌓는다는 거기 때문에 결국 한국에 대한 간접적인 위협이고요. 두 번째, 만약에 러시아 거기에 대해서는 대가로 핵기술이나 미사일 기술을 이전한 징후가 확실해질 경우에는 한국도 기존을 넘어서는 생각을 할 수밖에 없죠. 그건 사실상 한국에 대한 적대 행위라고 간주할 수밖에 없는 거니까요.
One analyst suggested that China, North Korea's closest ally for decades, could try to distance itself from the latest escalation.
China really doesn't care now about North Korea. Maybe this is some sort of diplomacy between Russia and North Korea that Kim Jong-un is doing. But, you know, Xi Jinping has to worry about its own economy, worry about its US-China relationship, doesn't want to be involved in some sort of new cold rivalry between US and other countries.
It's unknown what North Korea is getting in return for deploying its troops to Russia, but analysts believe it's possible that Pyongyang may carry out more provocations in the coming days and weeks to show its military might to the new leadership in the United States and the world, especially since it has its strategic partner, Russia, on its side. Lim Yang-seok, CNA, Seoul.
For more, we have Edward Howell joining us. He's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford and a Career Foundation Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Howell. Now, in the last few weeks and days, a lot of guessing, analysts, experts, policymakers about what North Korea is getting in return from Russia, what Russia is getting in return from North Korea. And we just heard our correspondent there saying it's still unclear. With the firing of the first ICBM in almost a year, so we see some advance from North Korea technologically. Is there any more sign of what North Korea or Russia might be getting in return for this new close relations between the two?
Thank you. So we know that over the past year, North Korea has supplied artillery shells, ballistic missiles to Russia. And in return, we know it's gained cash and it's gained food assistance. It's the military technology part that is the area in which we really don't know the specifics as to just what Russia has been transferring to North Korea. But what we do know is that it is this military technology, advanced missile technology, satellite technology, that Kim Jong-un values the most. So this is why this has attracted a lot of attention from observers. I think what we can say is that North Korea's latest ICBM launch, the first in over just a year, does highlight the concerning reality that North Korea is increasing the scope and sophistication of its nuclear development and its missile delivery systems. The missile flew for longer than an ICBM test last year, and it was obviously the longest flight time of any North Korean missile launch. This is concerning because it portends in the future that if Russian technology does end up in North Korea's direction, then Kim Jong-un will be able to accelerate the scope and sophistication of his missile capabilities.
So the progress that Pyongyang has made as far as the firing of this ICBM suggests there is no suggestion then that he might not need Russia quite as much, given the advance that North Korea itself has made on its missile development program.
I think if you're Kim Jong-un, any assistance that Russia can give in terms of advanced technology will be valued. It's quite clear that the reason why when Putin met Kim Jong-un in September last year, many observers thought they would meet in Vladivostok, the site of their previous meeting. But no, Putin took him to the Vostochny Cosmodrome. Kim Jong-un admired Russia's advanced technology. And now we're at a stage when actually we must remember it was North Korea that came to Russia's rescue early on, a year or so ago, when Putin was in dire need of North Korean artillery. That relationship has expanded, it's developed. We saw the signing of the Mutual Defense Pact, the partnership treaty earlier this year. We've now seen signs of North Korean troops being deployed to assist Putin. So if there's something that Russia can give back to North Korea, it may not be Russia's best military or missile technology, but any technology that does end up in Pyongyang's hands from Russia will be a benefit to Kim Jong-un.
All right, the enormous elephant in the room, which is keeping fairly silent, apart from a regular briefing from its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that's China, of course. China, we talk about mutual defense pact between Russia and North Korea. China is North Korea's only formal mutual defense treaty alliance partner. China also has a so-called no-limits partnership with Russia. So it's friends with both these two, and these two are now reaching out to each other. We heard an analyst there in the correspondence package saying China doesn't care now about North Korea. Can China ever afford not to care about either North Korea or Russia?
So I think first and foremost, China has been relatively cautious in what it has said, even when all we knew that North Korea was transferring to Russia was artillery. Okay, so in the first year of the Ukraine war. And even more recently, China has said that it does not know of any reports of North Korean troops being sent to Russia, and that actually, when pressed, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has said that this is basically a relationship between Russia and North Korea. It's their business, and China isn't getting involved. I think China is not going to be very happy at North Korea's renewed partnership with Russia, particularly now, and I say now, given the sending and the deployment of North Korean troops. I think China has a dilemma. On the one hand, it is clearly wanting to have a say on North Korea's foreign policy and on the Korean Peninsula. China has always wanted not to lose influence over North Korea. China signed the Korean War Armistice Agreement in 1953. China is North Korea's largest economic partner. Okay, if we think about it, up to now, China has been much more important to North Korea than Russia has. But that said, I think China is also very dissatisfied at how the West is responding to this. The US is strengthening alliances with South Korea and Japan. The West's response to Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. And so China is caught between a rock and a hard place. And I think that, what will it take, the question is, for China to step in and make clear that it is really unhappy about North Korean troops being sent to Russia. That said, I think we must also remember that Taiwan is a far more important foreign policy priority for China than North Korea is. China is perfectly happy if the Korean Peninsula remains stable and free from chaos. It doesn't like having a nuclear North Korea on its border. I think that is clear. But it's perfectly happy to help North Korea evade sanctions if that just calms the situation down. And the final point that we must remember is that Russia and China are still engaging in trade, particularly of dual-use technologies, that has and continue to assist Putin in the Ukraine war.
So essentially, Dr. Howell, looking at everyone having his or her own priorities when they calibrate their relations. Dr. Edward Howell, lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford. At least one person has been killed and 70 others injured after one of the biggest storms to hit Taiwan in nearly 3 decades. This made landfall on the east coast. Typhoon Kong-rey, packing wind speeds of more than 180 kilometers an hour, triggered waves of up to 10 meters in surrounding waters, causing flooding and mudslides. Authorities suspended work and schools and shut down financial markets, while also cancelling hundreds of flights and rail services. Nearly 500,000 households have been left without power. More CNA's Victoria Jen joins us live from Taipei. Victoria, we've just laid out, I suppose, the bare details of the impact of this typhoon. What more can you add to that report?
Well, Typhoon Conre has just made landfall in Taidong, in eastern part of Taiwan at 1:40 p.m. local time. Now, it's currently traveling right across Taiwan and moving at a speed of 21 kilometers per hour. And right now, the entire island is being covered by the typhoon with a radius of 320 kilometers. This is the biggest typhoon to hit Taiwan in nearly 30 years. Right now, I'm in Taipei. As you can see, that we are feeling the impact of the typhoon with strong rain, strong wind, and heavy rain. And we are also hearing reports that trees have been toppled and uprooted, and in many parts of the capital. So, but the situation is actually worse in the eastern part of Taiwan, where the typhoon made landfall. We're hearing that coastal areas are seeing waves up to 10 meters high, and nearly 500,000 households have been left without power. And there are reports that 2 foreigners are currently missing while they are on a hike in the mountainous areas. The Weather Bureau now predicts that there is going to be more floodings and landslides in many parts of Taiwan. And so the public is urged to stay on high alert and make necessary preparations. Most importantly, they are urged to stay indoors and avoid from traveling outside.
All right, Victoria, of course, Taiwan, no stranger to typhoons or storms like these, certainly during this season. This time, it's one of the biggest storms in almost 30 years. How have authorities prepared for this?
Yes, the government has already set up a central emergency operations center and to monitor the latest development of the typhoon. President William Lai has earlier visited the center this morning and instructed local government to do their best to minimize the potential damage and casualties. Now, thousands of residents have already been evacuated to nearby shelters, and the Defense Ministry has ordered 36,000 soldiers to be on standby for search and rescue missions. More than 6,000 first responders have also been put on standby for any emergency calls. Now, many residents were seeing that they have put sandbags around outside their homes to prevent flooding, and they also put up tapes on their glass windows because of the strong wind. Now, many people were also seen queuing at grocery stores, trying to stock up on their supplies, such as water and food. Now, the Weather Bureau predicts that this typhoon is expected to exit Taiwan later this evening, but the public is urged to stay on high alert because there is likely to be more rain next morning.
Oh, thanks. That's CNA's Victoria Jen reporting live from Taipei. Across the strait, coastal cities in China are preparing for Kong-rey. While it is not expected to make landfall on the Chinese mainland, Kong-rey will trek along the eastern coast tomorrow before swinging northeast towards Japan over the weekend. Fishing boats have been called back to harbours, while some ferry and train services have been suspended. The Central Weather Agency this morning raised the typhoon warning to the second most severe orange tier. Local reports say some 180 millimeters of rain are expected to fall in the coastal region from Thursday evening into Friday, while financial hub Shanghai possibly facing its heaviest rains in more than 4 decades. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, the yen shaking off its recent declines after comments from Japan's central bank chief fans speculation that another rate hike is likely as soon as December. And in China, factory activity returning to growth for the first time in 6 months. This is East Asia Tonight. It's time for business news with Roland Lim.
Hi, Risu. We kick off things with Hong Kong, where its third quarter result was its weakest in 15 months. Now, this is from weakening in exports and spending. Advanced official estimates for the quarter highlight the external and domestic challenges facing the Asian financial hub. Now, its gross domestic product grew 1.8% in the 3 months to September from a year ago. And that's lower than a downwardly revised 3.2% in the second quarter and misses consensus forecast. On a quarterly basis, the economy contracted 1.1%. The data captures the period before Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee announced a series of new measures to support the economy. It's also largely before China, which is Hong Kong's biggest trading partner and key source of investment, unveiled its largest stimulus efforts since the pandemic. Hong Kong's economy has been grappling with a property slowdown that's denting consumer confidence and spending. And China's faltering economic growth has also hurt the city, as mainland tourist arrivals still lag pre-pandemic levels. It's a different picture in Taiwan. The island's trade-reliant economy grew more than expected in the third quarter, boosted by strong demand for its chips from the AI boom. Preliminary data shows that GDP expanded nearly 4% on year between July and September, faster than the 3.4% median estimate in a Bloomberg poll. However, it's slower than the 5.06% growth in the second quarter. Taiwan is benefiting from soaring global demand for its chips and servers that its companies make, tech that is key to the advances in artificial intelligence. Earlier this month, shares in the city's biggest company, that's TSMC, hit all-time highs after its latest results eased concerns that the AI boom might have passed its peak. Still, Taiwan had warned that the economy would slow as 2024 comes to an end, and that's partly as exports growth slows. Last month, Taiwan's exports rose 4.5% on year, and that's less than half what economists had expected. The Japanese yen reversed its earlier losses to rise against the dollar, currently trading at 152.43 to the dollar. It's up by 0.64%. The Asian currency lifted by comments from Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda that fanned speculation of a potential rate hike as early as December. Mr. Ueda said that risks surrounding the U.S. economy have begun to subside, adding that currency movements are having a major impact on the economy and price trends. His remarks comes after the BOJ stood pat on interest rates, keeping the benchmark short-term rate steady at 0.25% as widely expected. This comes in the face of growing uncertainty ahead of the U.S. election and a lack of clarity over the future course of Japan's economic policy. In its quarterly outlook, the BOJ said the economy is expected to expand at a pace above its potential growth rate. Inflation likely to be at around 2.5% this year, and it may ease to about 2% over the next 2 years due to the recent decline in commodity prices. The BOJ also highlighted that the main upside risks for Japan would hinge on economic activity and inflation in other global markets. The stronger yen weighed on Japanese equities, the Nikkei 225 snapping a 3-day gain as investors sold to lock in profits, and that led the benchmark to close 0.5% lower. Now, China's factory activity unexpectedly expanded after 5 months of contraction, suggesting Beijing's emergency stimulus blitz to revive the economy is starting to take effect. Official manufacturing PMI returned to growth in October, edging up to 50.1. Now, that's above the 50 mark, separating expansion from contraction from the previous month. The mood in the manufacturing sector had been depressed for months because of tumbling producer prices and dwindling orders. The survey is the first official economic indicator for the month after China introduced its boldest stimulus package since the pandemic. But some analysts say it's still too early for the measures to have a direct impact on the latest numbers. The government is expected to announce more details of its fiscal policy support next week at a much-anticipated meeting of the country's top lawmakers. In a further encouraging sign, the non-manufacturing measure of activity also expanded in October, providing some relief to policymakers even as other indicators have suggested recovery in the world's number 2 economy remain distant. Let's see how the markets reacted. Both the Shanghai and the Shenzhen closing in the green. Hong Kong's Hang Seng, however, down 0.3% today. Samsung Electronics has reported better than expected third quarter profit on improving demand for chips. But the pace of recovery weakened from the prior quarter as it lags behind its peers in the artificial intelligence race. Operating profit for Samsung came in at $7.1 billion, slightly above its earnings guidance announced earlier this month, which was below market expectations at the time. A South Korean company this month made a rare apology for its disappointing earnings, citing delays in sales of its advanced chips. The tech giant has been playing catch-up with its smaller rivals, including SK Hynix and TSMC, in supplying high-end AI chips to market leader NVIDIA. It also faces growing competition from Chinese rivals for commodity chips. But the outlook is not all downbeat. In a post-earnings briefing, Samsung said it has made, quote, meaningful progress in the qualification process for its most advanced AI memory chips to NVIDIA. And let's see how the market reacted. Samsung shares, the stock rose more than 3% at one point, but paired off those gains to close just above the flat line. Rival SK Hynix tanked more than 4%, and that brought the benchmark Kospi index down 1.5%, no thanks to those two heavyweights above. And that is the latest in business. Back to you, Wei Su.
And thanks for that, Roland. Still ahead on this bulletin, the new study points to climate change exacerbating the intensity and frequency of deadly weather events. But how ready are the world's major cities for this expected climatic onslaught? We put that question to an expert in just a moment. Stay with us. Typhoon Kong-rey, the largest storm to hit Taiwan in decades, makes landfall, shutting financial markets and forcing the cancellation of hundreds of flights. North Korea test fires its first long-range ballistic missile in almost a year in a fiery warning to the U.S. and its allies that it can and will strike back under what it sees as provocation. And South Korean authorities and residents thwart a plan by activists to float anti-Pyongyang leaflets across the heavily fortified border. Picking up on that report, this taking place in Paju. Now, that is a South Korean city about 10 kilometers away from the border with North Korea. Activists drawn from families of people believed to have been kidnapped by North Korea made speeches as they prepared to release balloons carrying messages against Pyongyang. But they backed down after encountering strong resistance from local residents. They were worried about reprisals from the north.
그래가지고 이제 맨날 등골이 오싹오싹하게 살았는데 요즘 들어서는 너무 힘들어요. 그리고 대북 전단을 좀 안 뿌려주셨으면 진짜 감사하고 또 감사하겠어요. 그래서 너무나 힘드니까 어떻게 말로 다 표현을 못하는 거예요.
The launching of anti-North leaflets by activists across the border has driven up tensions between the two Koreas. Pyongyang sent thousands of rubbish-filled balloons to the south in retaliation. A new study has revealed that some of the deadliest weather disasters over the past 20 years were directly intensified by climate change. The report by the World Weather Attribution says human-induced environment change contributed to more than 570,000 weather-related deaths and has done so since 2004. That extreme events such as heat waves, floods, and deadly storms will become more frequent. The study highlights how climate change is already very dangerous at 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming, and that nowhere is safe, with large death tolls from extreme weather recorded in both rich and poor countries. The growing risks of more frequent extreme weather events are putting governments around the world under increased pressure to adapt. Well, we speak to Professor Benjamin Horton. He is Director, Earth Observatory of Singapore at the Nanyang Technological University. Thanks for joining us, Professor Horton. Now, we've just had this new study, but in fact, we are not short of evidence to show that intense weather events are getting more intense just as they are becoming more frequent. The science clearly not translating into the kind of policies to actually address these huge changes. Why is that so?
Well, I think you can see in evidence in front of you that the burning of fossil fuels is increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's causing record-breaking temperatures in our atmosphere and our ocean. When you have record-breaking temperatures in our atmosphere, that causes more heat waves, that causes more droughts, that causes more wildfires. When you have record-breaking temperatures in our oceans, that provides the energy for more intense storms, bigger storm surges, heavier and more intense rainfall, which causes landslides. The evidence is ever so clear that the burning of fossil fuels affects our lives and livelihoods. And our cities that have been designed for a climate of last century just aren't quite simply resilient enough for the disasters that will increase in their frequency and intensity in this century.
So cities are not prepared for the catastrophes of today, let alone the catastrophes of tomorrow. So in principle, if they catch up even to what they need to see to today, by that point, they will be out of date for what is likely to happen very soon in the future. Is this message actually getting through?
Well, I think that's the crux of the problem. The scientific community have been predicting the problems that we're experiencing today, and they are also predicting the problems that we'll experience in the future. We need to follow the science. Every city has a university. For example, here in Singapore, we have world-class universities like NUS, SMU, and where I am at NTU. We have scientists that are producing the latest projections on how hot Singapore will be, what the rainfall will be like in Singapore, how high sea levels will be. This then now needs to be communicated effectively to policymakers to make sure that we can build the cities of tomorrow. That's what people want. They want cities that are going to be resilient to flooding, to heat waves, and to rising sea levels.
The problem, however, is adaptation. I think you will concede that as well. It's an enormous task. It's not just infrastructure. It's not just dikes. It's not just seawalls. It's how we plan, how we build, how we live, how we manage our waste, how we think even of ourselves. If adaptation is such a huge task, you can see why it's so hard to even grasp. It's so hard to measure progress. How do we even start on adaptation, let alone mitigation?
I disagree with that. I think it's quite simple on how we act. We need to think about short-term measures, medium-term measures, and then what are the longer-term solutions. In the short term, we need proper communication. We need proper disaster management plans, because many of these disasters, we have hours, days, even weeks' notice of when they're going to occur. We cannot simply have any misinformation regarding this. These disasters are going to happen at an increasing frequency. When a policymaker says a flood is a once-in-a-100-year event, that simply isn't true. That's a once-in-a-100-year event of last century. With climate change, these now occur every decade or every 5 years. In the medium term, we need to make our cities more resilient, and that does not need to be costly. There are many nature-based solutions that we can use. For example, if you want to cool a city, reintegrate vegetation, put that in urban design, make your community have small-scale gardens and forests. This cools a city, but then has many other value-added benefits in terms of biodiversity and actually storing carbon out of the atmosphere. If we want to reduce flooding, we do not need to build dikes and seawalls everywhere. Again, we can use vegetation, mangroves and corals. They take the energy out of a storm surge. But again, they clean our water, they increase our biodiversity, and they store carbon. But long term, the only solution for a safer and sustainable city is to reduce the amount of carbon we are using. We have known for decades now that we need to move away from greenhouse gases. The United Nations says that we must keep below the 1.5 degrees C threshold. To do that, we need to reduce our carbon consumption within the next 6 years, that is by 2030, by around 30%. And that's a fact. There's no will or want about that. You just need to follow the science.
Oh, Professor Horton, final question here. The science is evident. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, hand on heart. But the very fact that, as you say, we cannot have misinformation, but we just saw misinformation, certainly in Florida. So these things do happen. If the key lies in effective communication, is there anything you might want to recommend on that strategy that would improve communication and actually see governments and people carrying out these policies that you know are evident and should be carried out?
Well, I think there is one simple message and it doesn't cost you a dime. Talk about climate change. Become educated. I don't think it's sufficient enough just to know that climate change is happening. I don't think it's sufficient enough to know that humans are responsible. You must understand the impacts, that if we don't solve the climate crisis, we're going to have more frequent disasters of a greater intensity. We are going to destroy lives and livelihoods. Money is worthless on a dead planet. Your health will be destroyed on a dead planet, and your education system will collapse. The frustration of a climate scientist is that we know what the future will hold, but also the hope is that we have all the solutions in front of us. If only we can communicate and we can talk about how we can integrate a value for nature when we think about how we design our cities for the future.
All right, and certainly adding to that communication, Professor Benjamin Horton, Director, Earth Observatory of Singapore Nanyang Technological University. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's less than a week to go to the U.S. presidential elections, and early voting is underway across the country. And in a peculiar case, a Chinese student has been arrested for illegally casting a ballot in Michigan. The unnamed 19-year-old from the University of Michigan is not a U.S. citizen. At a voting site, the student used his university ID and other documents to prove his residency in the state, and also filled out a same-day voter registration form. After casting his ballot, he wanted to retrieve his vote, but that was no longer possible because it had already been entered into the tabulator. Due to vote secrecy, ballots cast at in-person voting sites do not contain any personal information about the voter, making it impossible to identify and thus nullify the illegal vote. The student is now facing 1 count of perjury and a count of illegally attempting to vote. Our state lawmakers, meantime, have criticized the Democrats for not requiring proof of citizenship before voting. A Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, has called on Americans to stop pointing fingers at each other as she tries to push past a comment by President Joe Biden that could potentially undermine her campaign. Mr. Biden referred to Republican contender Donald Trump supporters as, quote, garbage, sparking a row as both candidates count down to next week's vote. Mr. Biden clarified that he had in fact been referring to one Trump supporter, that's comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, who had called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage at a Trump rally on Sunday. But there are concerns this remark could undermine the Harris camp's message of unity. The vice president has tried to distance herself from that comment, saying she strongly disagrees with criticizing people based on who they vote for.
I believe that the work that I do is about representing all the people, whether they support me or not. And as President of the United States, I will be a president for all Americans, whether you vote for me or not. That is my responsibility, and that's the kind of work that I've done my entire career, and I take it very seriously.
Mr. Trump, speaking at a rally in North Carolina, hit back at President Biden's comment, saying his supporters are of higher quality than his. He also took aim at his rival, saying Ms. Harris is not fit to lead the country.
My response to Joe and Kamala is very simple. You can't lead America if you don't love Americans. You just and you can't be president if you hate the American people. And there's a lot of hatred there.
Still ahead on East Asia tonight, we turn our focus to one issue that both U.S. presidential candidates largely see eye to eye, as America's strategic rivalry with China. Let's find out what warming weather is doing to one of Japan's most famous sites. As the race for the White House approaches its climax, there is one issue that both Ms. Harris and Mr. Trump might see eye to eye on, and that is the position of China as a strategic rival. Will an already turbulent relationship become even more stormy, or could the next man or woman in the Oval Office reset ties with Beijing? Cna Insight takes a look at one product that has been caught in the crosshairs of the US-China trade war.
In the woods of Wisconsin, Will Su is foraging for something you wouldn't normally associate with the American Midwest: ginseng.
So we're in luck today. We found one. I didn't catch it until it was in my peripheral vision. And what caught me was this slight yellowing of the leaves. So sometimes ginseng is called green gold. In the fall, the leaves will turn this from green to yellow, and it's a little bit earlier than some of the other plants in the area. So this leaf here actually fell from the plant too. And so sometimes you can spot it based on these leaves turning this goldish color earlier than the rest of the foliage. And I think there might be another one nearby too that's a smaller plant. You want to dig it?
There's a reason Will is so familiar with the ginseng, a plant commonly used in Chinese traditional medicine. His family owns a 100-acre farm growing the herb.
Currently, there's about 1 million pounds of ginseng produced annually from the state of Wisconsin, and 95% of it is grown here in central Wisconsin. The buyers typically come over from Hong Kong, mainland China, Taiwan, East Asia, and come every fall into the winter time frame.
When the trade war started in 2018, China retaliated with tariffs on imported U.S. ginseng. It started with 7.5%, to 15%, to 32.5%, at one point reaching 41%. Ginseng exports plunged by 80% as China stopped buying from America and turned to other suppliers.
The start of the trade war in 2018 was this gradual decline in demand for the product because of the artificial increase in price. That's what a tariff is. It increases the price to the buyer or to the end consumer, and it passes that on. Typically, most people believe it gets passed on to the consumer. However, in a smaller market like this, what tends to happen is the tariffs get actually passed back to the farmer, because the buyer and the foreign consumer doesn't want to pay more for the product. No one likes paying more for stuff. This product is so dependent on the Chinese economy and the Chinese consumer that we can't find a large enough market outside of Greater China to sell the product. So in 2018, the crop was trading for around $40 a pound. Today, it trades at about a 30 to 50% discount to that, roughly $20 to $25 a pound. I mean, to the point of where farmers can't make money growing the crop. We're selling below cost.
Will's father, Paul, who started the ginseng farm in 1974, has weathered many storms in the industry over the decades, including price wars with competitors, bad weather, and poor harvests. But this US-China trade war has him questioning about the fate of his lifelong passion.
Wisconsin ginseng rely on China for 85% of its market, at least, if not 90%, 85% for sure. But in the last 5 years, even 6, 7 years now, after Trump's administration has a trade war, let's slap on 32.5% of tariff onto our ginseng. So we have been suffering. We are getting the price of 1980s. Can you imagine?
Apart from ginseng, China would slap retaliatory tariffs on a host of other agricultural products, such as soy, sorghum, and pork. This was estimated to have cost the U.S. about $27 to $30 billion in lost agricultural exports between mid-2018 and 2019.
One of the things that happened when the Trump tariffs went into effect was the Chinese switched their purchase patterns. They started buying soybeans, for example, from Brazil. And that is market share that we've never entirely regained.
As a truce in 2020, President Trump signed a Phase 1 trade deal with China. The deal committed China to buy $200 billion worth of American exports by 2021. However, 2 years later, analysis of the deal showed that China did not purchase any of those goods and services. Meanwhile, tariffs widened under President Biden, and trade continued to decline between the two superpowers.
In terms of those China's exports to United States during those round of a trade war from 2018 to 2019, at least about more than $19 billion has lost in terms of China's exports to the United States, and about almost $40 billion in terms of imports from the United States to China. China used to be the biggest trade partner of the United States. Nowadays, China is the fourth trade partner.
I want German car companies to become American car companies. I want them to build their plants here. I want to beat China in electronics production, and we'll be able to do that easily. Under my leadership, we're going to take other countries' jobs.
Over the last 3.5 years, we brought manufacturing back to America. We created 730,000 manufacturing jobs and announced the opening of more than 20 new auto plants in the United States. And we did it by investing in American industry and American workers. And I want to make sure that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century.
You can catch Insight, the U.S. election and U.S.-China rivalry under a new president tonight at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. You can also watch it on CNA Video on Demand or on CNA Insider's YouTube page. Before we go, we turn to Japan's famous Mount Fuji. Now, as winter approaches, Mount Fuji conjures up an image of a snow-capped peak, except it's snowless at the moment, breaking a 130-year record, which noted that snow has been on those slopes off and around since early October. The phenomenon this year has been attributed to unusually warm conditions. The previous record was set twice in 1955 and more recently in 2016. Experts say scorching summer temperatures and high ocean temperatures may have delayed the onset of winter. But fans of the iconic view may not have to wait too long. Local forecaster says snow could fall possibly by next week. And that's East Asia Tonight this Thursday. Don't forget headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, we're on Facebook, YouTube, and X.